There was a young man filled with dreams and ambitions. He had always believed that hard work and dedication would lead him to the life he wanted. From a young age, he had shown an incredible drive to succeed, always pushing himself to do better, to be better. Whether it was school, sports, or any other aspect of life, he approached everything with a determination that made others take notice. His dream was clear. He wanted to become successful in a field that he had long admired. This field, one that demanded both skill and creativity, was the very thing that excited him every day. He often spent countless hours studying, learning, and refining his talents, fully believing that if he worked hard enough, he could make it. It wasn't just about the fame or the money. It was about proving to himself that he could achieve something meaningful. The thought of one day seeing his name recognized, being acknowledged for his hard work, was a dream he held close to his heart. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Things were not always as easy as they seemed, and the path to his dream was filled with obstacles. While many of his peers seemed to move forward effortlessly, he found himself constantly fighting for every opportunity. This only fueled his desire to succeed even more. He knew that success wasn't handed to anyone. It was something earned. And earn it he would. He worked harder than ever, sacrificing nights out with friends, missing family gatherings, and sometimes even skipping meals just to stay focused on his goals. Every moment he spent working was a step closer to where he wanted to be, he believed. His passion and determination were unwavering. But one day, things began to shift in a way he hadn't expected. It started with a phone call. On the other end of the line was someone who was struggling, someone who had always been there for him, and now it was his turn to help. This wasn't just any call. It was a call that would change the course of his life. It was his father, someone he had always admired and looked up to. His father, who had always been strong, wise, and supportive, was now in a difficult situation. Over the years, he had worked hard to provide for the family, but now he was facing something that could break everything he had worked for. A sudden illness had left him unable to work, and medical bills were piling up. The young man's father had always been the rock of their family, and now it seemed that rock was crumbling. Hearing his father's voice crack with worry, the young man knew that something had to be done. His father had always provided for him and his siblings, and now it was time for him to return that care. He could not sit idly by while his father, the one who had sacrificed so much, struggled. But helping his father meant one thing: putting his own dreams on hold. It was a decision that weighed heavily on him. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, knowing that this was a crossroads in his life. On one hand, he had his dream, a future filled with promise but uncertain. On the other hand, he had his family, his father, who needed him now more than ever. The young man knew that in this moment he had to make a choice. His ambition, the one thing he had fought so hard for, would have to wait. His father's health and well-being took precedence, and he knew that the right thing to do was to step up and help. At first, the young man thought he could balance both. He would continue working toward his dreams while also helping his father. But reality quickly set in. He couldn't give his all to both things, not in the way that was needed. His father needed him every day, and with each passing day, the pressure of his father's condition grew heavier. There were doctor's appointments, bills to pay, and a million other small things that needed attention. His father's life was on the line, and the young man couldn't focus on anything else. It wasn't long before he made the difficult decision. He would put his dreams on hold. It wasn't easy. Every fiber of his being wanted to continue the journey he had started, but deep down he knew what he had to do. His father had given him everything, and now it was time for him to give back. So the young man set aside his ambitions. He began taking on more responsibility at home. He worked additional hours to help cover expenses and ensured that his father had everything he needed. He even took over the household chores, things that he had never considered before. The days began to blend into one another, with each one feeling like a small sacrifice for the sake of his family's well-being. But it wasn't just the physical tasks that drained him. It was the emotional toll of watching someone he loved struggle. There were moments when the young man would sit alone at night, his mind racing. He would think of the dreams he had, the life he could have been living. It was hard not to feel frustrated, especially when his friends seemed to move forward with their own lives while he felt stuck in place. There were days when the weight of his decision felt unbearable, but in those quiet moments, something else became clear. He wasn't just sacrificing his future for his father's present. He was learning something invaluable. He was learning the power of selflessness. He was learning what it truly meant to put someone else's needs above his own. And despite the frustration, despite the sense of loss, there was a sense of pride that came with the knowledge that he was doing the right thing. His dreams might have to wait, but they weren't disappearing. They were just on hold for a while. And in that pause, he realized something important. Sometimes life wasn't just about reaching for your own goals. Sometimes the greatest accomplishment came from helping others reach theirs. And he knew that when the time came to chase his dreams again, he would be better for it. But for now, he had made his choice and he would stand by it. The young man's story was far from over. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that helping his father through this time was the right thing to do. In the end, he had learned that sacrifice, though difficult, was sometimes the most important part of life's journey. And that lesson would stay with him, even when he eventually returned to the path he had once set out on. For now, though, he was content knowing that he was making a difference in the life of the person who had always been there for him. He could only hope that one day his father would be able to look back and see just how much his son had given, not just to his family, but to the future they all shared. As the days passed, the young man became more and more immersed in the responsibility he had taken on. At first, there was a sense of purpose. He knew what he was doing was important, and it gave him a sense of fulfillment. But as time went on, the exhaustion began to set in. The long hours at work, combined with caring for his father, left little room for rest. There were days when he barely had time to sit down and eat, let alone take a moment to himself. His father's condition seemed to improve slowly, which, while a relief, also meant that there were more appointments to attend and more things to manage. The young man had hoped that things would ease up after a while, but it felt like the weight only grew heavier. He was grateful for the moments of progress, but they often came with new challenges. Every step forward seemed to bring two more things that needed his attention. The stress was beginning to take its toll. He found himself feeling more irritable than usual. Small things that wouldn't normally bother him seemed to set him off. He could feel the pressure building, and there were nights when he lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had made the right choice. Would his father have been okay without him? Could someone else have stepped in to help? Or was he the only one who could do it? During these moments of doubt, he would remind himself why he had made this decision in the first place. His father had always been there for him. No matter what he needed, his father was there working hard to provide for the family and teaching him the importance of dedication and sacrifice. Now it was his turn to return that care. He couldn't walk away from his family when they needed him most, no matter how difficult it became. Still, the feeling of sacrificing his own future for the sake of someone else's present weighed heavily on him. It was as though his own dreams were slipping further and further away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He would catch himself thinking about the life he could have had, the career he could have built, the success he could have tasted. The idea of starting over, of building his future from scratch, seemed almost impossible, but no one could see the struggle he was going through. To the outside world, it looked like he was handling everything well. He went to work, took care of his father, and never complained. He kept up appearances, telling everyone that everything was fine, that he was doing just what he needed to do, but inside he was breaking. He was angry at himself for giving up his dreams. He was angry at the situation for pulling him away from the life he had wanted. And most of all, he was angry that no one seemed to understand just how hard it was to do what he was doing. At work, things weren't getting any easier. The young man's boss had noticed that he wasn't as focused as he once was. His productivity had slowed down, and it hadn't gone unnoticed. He had always been the employee who stayed late, the one who went above and beyond, but now he was barely managing to meet deadlines. It wasn't that he wasn't trying, it was just that his mind was consumed by everything going on at home. One day, his boss pulled him aside and asked if everything was all right. It was a simple question, but it made the young man feel even more alone. He didn't want to admit that he was struggling. He didn't want anyone to see how much he was suffering. He didn't want to look weak, so he lied. He said everything was fine, that he just had a lot on his plate. His boss nodded, but the concern in his eyes was clear. It was obvious to the young man that his struggles were not invisible, but he couldn't bring himself to open up. The more he tried to push his own feelings aside, the more they started to creep up in unexpected ways. There were moments when he would snap at his father, when the frustration of his own unmet dreams boiled over. His father, ever patient, would just nod and say he understood, but the guilt would hit the young man almost immediately. How could he be angry at the person who had given him everything? His father was suffering too in his own way, and yet he never once complained. One afternoon, as the young man was sorting through some medical paperwork for his father, his phone buzzed with a message from an old friend. It had been months since they had last spoken. The message was simple. "Hey, just wanted to check in. How have you been?" The young man stared at the message for a moment, unsure of what to say. He hadn't really had the time or energy to catch up with anyone. His life had become consumed by responsibilities. But something in that simple message made him pause. His friend had no idea what he was going through, and yet here they were reaching out. For a brief moment, the young man allowed himself to remember what it was like before everything had changed, before his dreams had been put on hold, before his life had been defined by someone else's needs. He replied, but the conversation quickly turned to his own life. His friend asked what had been happening, and the young man found himself hesitating. Could he really explain everything that had happened? Could he tell them how much he was struggling without sounding like he was complaining? In the end, he just said, "Things are busy. Helping out with my dad." He didn't go into details, but that conversation stirred something inside him. It made him realize just how much he had sacrificed, and how little he had allowed himself to mourn that loss. It was like he had been so focused on taking care of others that he had forgotten to take care of himself. For the first time in a long time, he asked himself, what do I need? What do I want? And could he still have those things even if it meant accepting that he had made a difficult choice? As he sat there reflecting on his friend's message, the young man realized that he had been carrying a heavy burden. He had been so consumed by the need to help his father that he had forgotten to acknowledge his own struggles. He had sacrificed his own future for someone else's present, but that didn't mean he had to lose himself in the process. It was a turning point for him. He understood now that self-care wasn't selfish. It was necessary. He couldn't pour from an empty cup. If he was going to continue helping his father, he needed to find a way to fill his own cup again. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to pursue his dreams after all. But first he needed to heal, to accept that it was okay to feel tired, to feel lost, and to take a step back and breathe. The young man didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in months he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he could find a way to balance both his responsibilities and his dreams. It wouldn't be easy, but he was starting to believe that it was possible. The young man had been at a crossroads for a while now. Every day felt like a blur of obligations, and despite his best efforts, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing a part of himself. He had made a choice to put his dreams on hold, but as the weeks passed, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the deep longing inside him. He had sacrificed so much already for his father, and while he didn't regret helping, there was a part of him that was afraid he had lost who he was in the process. It wasn't that his father wasn't worth the sacrifice. His father had always been his hero, the one person who had always been there for him no matter what. But the weight of caring for someone else's future while letting his own dreams fade away was starting to take a toll. He had always been someone who believed in the power of hard work and determination, and now he was beginning to question if those values had somehow betrayed him. His father had made tremendous progress, and that was a relief. The doctors were optimistic, and his health had improved significantly, which meant there were fewer things to manage on a daily basis. For the first time in months, the young man felt a small sense of relief. He could see a light at the end of the tunnel, but that light also made him realize just how much time had passed while he had been focused entirely on someone else's needs. He began to wonder, was it possible to pick up the pieces of his own life again? Could he still find a way to chase his dreams without letting go of the responsibility he had taken on? He wasn't sure, but he knew that he couldn't keep living this way, distracted, overwhelmed, and disconnected from his own passions. One evening, after his father had gone to bed, the young man found himself sitting alone in the living room. The house was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to just think. It was a rare moment of peace, and as he sat there, he thought about all the things he had put aside, the career he had dreamed of, the passion he had for his work, and the sense of purpose that had once fueled him. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through social media. It was something he rarely did these days. He didn't have the time for it, but something about the stillness of the evening made him want to connect with the world again. As he scrolled, he saw posts from old friends, people he had once been close to. They were all living their lives, pursuing their own dreams, achieving things he had once hoped to achieve. For a moment, it felt like a punch to the gut. He had been so focused on helping his father that he had completely disconnected from everything and everyone. It wasn't just about missing out on experiences. It was about realizing that he had stopped living for himself. He had become a caretaker, a provider, but in doing so, he had lost sight of the person he once was. The realization hit him harder than he expected. He had been so caught up in the idea of doing the right thing, of being selfless, that he had neglected the things that mattered most to him. His own future, his own happiness had taken a back seat, and he was starting to feel like he had forgotten how to dream. The next few days were filled with reflection. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The longing inside him had become too loud to silence. He wanted to find a way to balance his responsibilities with his own dreams. But it wasn't going to be easy. He couldn't just walk away from his father's care. He had promised to be there, and he wasn't about to break that promise. But somehow he had to figure out a way to start living again. He began to make small changes. He started waking up a little earlier in the mornings before his father needed him. It wasn't much, but it gave him a brief window of time to work on the things that he had put aside. He dusted off his old notebooks, the ones filled with ideas and plans for his future. The pages were yellowed and worn, but the words on them still felt alive. As he read through his old notes, he realized that he had once been so full of excitement and hope. It was as though those dreams were waiting for him to come back and breathe life into them again. One evening, after spending some time working on his own goals, he decided to take a walk. He had been cooped up in the house for so long, and he needed a break from everything. As he walked through the quiet streets, he couldn't help but think about how different his life was now. It felt like he was walking through a fog, unsure of where he was headed but still moving forward one step at a time. It was during that walk that something unexpected happened. He bumped into an old acquaintance, someone he hadn't seen in years. At first, the young man wasn't sure if he should engage. He didn't feel like talking about his life or his struggles, but the acquaintance seemed genuinely happy to see him. And after a few minutes of small talk, they started to catch up. The conversation turned to work, and the young man found himself telling his acquaintance about the challenges he had faced in the past few months. He wasn't looking for sympathy, but it felt good to talk to someone who didn't have any expectations of him. As he spoke, he realized just how much he had been holding in. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to be honest about his feelings. His acquaintance listened intently, offering words of encouragement without trying to fix everything. It was a refreshing change from the usual well-meaning advice he received from family and friends. The young man didn't need advice. He just needed someone to listen, someone to hear the weight of his words without judgment. As they parted ways, the young man felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in a long time. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but he knew that he had to start living again. He had to find a way to pursue his dreams while still being there for his father. It wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to figure it out. In the days that followed, he began to make more time for himself. He started carving out small moments to work on his goals, whether it was writing down ideas or taking online courses. Every little step he took felt like a victory. He was no longer just a caretaker. He was someone who was reclaiming their future. The young man knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't too late to pursue his dreams. He didn't have to sacrifice everything. With balance, with patience, and with a little bit of faith, he could have the future he had always wanted, while still being the son his father needed. As the weeks passed, the young man's life started to shift in small yet meaningful ways. For the first time in months, he began to find a balance between his responsibilities and his dreams. It wasn't perfect, and there were still many days when he felt overwhelmed, but he could sense that something inside him was beginning to change. He was no longer just existing. He was starting to live again. One of the biggest changes was in his attitude. For so long, he had focused on what he had given up, on the dreams that had faded in the background, but now he was beginning to see things differently. Every day was no longer just a series of obligations and sacrifices. It had become an opportunity, a chance to rebuild, to reclaim the life he had once dreamed of while still caring for his father. He didn't have to choose between one or the other. He realized that the two could coexist. His father, who had always been his rock, would continue to need his help, but that didn't mean he had to give up everything else. He started to make time for both, the care his father required and the passion he had once held for his work. It wasn't easy, and some days felt like he was walking a tightrope, but it was a start. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table, his father across from him sipping tea, the young man reflected on how far they had both come. His father's health had improved significantly, and although he still needed assistance, he was able to do more for himself. It was a relief, but it also brought a new challenge. How would he navigate this new chapter of their lives? He found himself wondering if his father would feel guilty that his son had given up so much for him. They had always been close, and the young man knew that his father wouldn't want him to sacrifice his future for his present. But the truth was, the young man had never seen it as a sacrifice. It had been a choice he would make again in a heartbeat. Still, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what he had put aside. One night, as he tucked his father into bed after a long day of appointments, his father looked up at him and smiled. There was a quiet understanding in his eyes. He knew that the young man had been through a lot, and there was no need for words. But in that moment, the young man felt a deep sense of gratitude for the man who had shaped his life in so many ways. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, he realized that he had never been alone in this journey. His father had always been there, and now it was his turn to return the favor. The next day, the young man woke up with a new sense of purpose. He had made progress, but it wasn't enough. There was still so much he wanted to achieve, and he wasn't willing to let it slip away. He had spent so many months putting his dreams on hold, but now he felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't going to wait for the perfect moment. It was time to take action. He started by revisiting the things he had once been passionate about. He began working on small projects, things that would bring him closer to his goals. It wasn't about making huge leaps, it was about taking small, steady steps forward. Every task he completed, every small accomplishment, gave him the confidence to keep going. At work, things were starting to look up as well. His boss had noticed the improvement in his performance, and the young man was slowly regaining the trust and respect he had earned before his father's illness. His colleagues, too, began to notice the change in him. He was more focused, more engaged, and it was clear that he was no longer just going through the motions. Despite the progress, there were still moments when the young man felt the weight of everything on his shoulders. There were days when the demands of work and family would threaten to overwhelm him. But he had learned to be kinder to himself. He understood that he couldn't do it all perfectly, and that was okay. The most important thing was that he was trying, that he was making an effort to rebuild both his life and his dreams. One afternoon, while taking a break from work, he sat in a nearby park. It was a quiet place, and the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind offered a sense of calm. He had been so busy for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to simply be still, to take a moment to breathe. He closed his eyes and let the peacefulness wash over him, allowing himself to just be present in the moment. As he sat there, something inside him shifted. It was as if the weight he had been carrying for so long had lightened, even if just for a moment. He realized that life wasn't about being perfect, it was about being present, about making the most of each day. The past few months had been hard, but they had taught him something valuable. He had learned the importance of patience, of self-care, and of finding balance. And most importantly, he had learned that he didn't have to choose between his dreams and his responsibilities. Both could coexist if he allowed them to. Later that evening, as he sat down to have dinner with his father, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. His father, always the one to offer advice, had noticed the change in him. There was a quiet pride in his father's eyes as he watched his son, no longer burdened by the weight of his own dreams, but instead focused on the path ahead. The young man realized that his father had always known what he needed, even when he didn't. His father had never pressured him to give up his dreams. He had simply been there, offering love and support, knowing that his son would find his way in his own time. And now the young man understood that it wasn't about choosing between the past and the future. It was about living fully in the present, making the most of every moment, and building a life that was meaningful to him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that he didn't need to. What mattered was that he had taken control of his own future, that he was no longer letting his circumstances dictate his life. The young man had found his balance and he was ready to move forward. He knew that his journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, he was excited for what lay ahead. As time passed, the young man continued to navigate the delicate balance between caring for his father and pursuing his own dreams. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when the weight of everything felt almost too much to bear. But somehow, with each passing day, he learned to manage his responsibilities without losing sight of who he was. His life wasn't perfect, but it had become something more meaningful than he ever could have imagined. One day he sat down to reflect on everything that had happened over the past few months. The journey had been far from easy, and there had been many moments of doubt, frustration, and exhaustion. But in those quiet moments of reflection, he began to realize something that had eluded him before. The sacrifices he had made weren't wasted. They had shaped him into someone stronger, more resilient, and more understanding of what truly mattered in life. Looking back, he could see that the most significant change hadn't been in his career or his father's health. It had been in his perspective. The young man had learned that it wasn't about choosing between his dreams and his responsibilities. It was about embracing both, accepting that life was a journey full of twists and turns and finding meaning in the process, rather than focusing solely on the end goal. The young man's father had made remarkable progress. His health had improved enough that he no longer needed constant assistance. While there were still moments when he needed help, it was clear that he was regaining his independence. For the first time in a long time, the young man realized that he could start shifting his focus. His father was on the path to recovery, and now it was time for the young man to take the next step in his own journey. But even with the knowledge that his father's health was improving, there was a lingering feeling of guilt. It wasn't that he didn't want to follow his own dreams. It was just that he didn't want to abandon his father now that he had started to regain his strength. For so long, the young man had been the one to support his father, and he wasn't sure how to transition back to focusing on himself without feeling like he was letting his father down. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, the young man's father broke the silence. "You've done so much for me," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I've seen how hard you've worked, how much you've given up, and I want you to know from the bottom of my heart that I'm proud of you, but you also deserve to live your life. You don't have to keep putting your dreams on hold for me." The words struck the young man deeply. It was as though a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He had spent so much time worrying about his father, fearing that he was neglecting his own dreams, that he hadn't fully realized that his father had never expected him to sacrifice his future. His father's words were a reminder that the love between them didn't require such sacrifices. It wasn't about giving up one life for the other. It was about supporting each other and finding joy in the journey no matter where it took them. The next day, the young man made a decision. He would no longer feel guilty about pursuing his own dreams. He would continue to care for his father, but he would also begin to build the future he had once set aside. It wouldn't happen overnight, but he knew that it was time to take the first step. He started small, working on projects that excited him, reconnecting with old friends and finding new opportunities that aligned with his passions. The more he took action, the more he realized that his dreams weren't as distant as they had once seemed. He could still achieve what he had set out to do, but now he was doing it on his own terms. There were challenges, of course. There were days when he felt overwhelmed, when the responsibilities of caring for his father and pursuing his dreams felt like too much. But those moments no longer defined him. He had learned to take breaks when needed, to ask for help and to give himself the grace to rest. He wasn't perfect and he didn't need to be. What mattered was that he was living in a way that felt true to himself. The young man began to share his journey with others, opening up about the sacrifices he had made and the lessons he had learned. To his surprise, many of the people he spoke to had gone through similar experiences. He wasn't alone in feeling torn between the responsibilities of caring for others and the desire to chase personal dreams. Through these conversations, he began to realize that the journey he had taken wasn't just about him. It was about the people he had connected with along the way. One day, as he was working on a new project, he received a call from his old boss. The company had an opening for a position that aligned perfectly with his skills and passions. The timing couldn't have been better. The young man was both excited and nervous, but he knew that this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. It wasn't just a job. It was a chance to build the future he had dreamed of while still honoring the sacrifices he had made for his father. He took the job, but he also made sure to maintain the balance he had worked so hard to find. He continued to support his father, but now he was doing it from a place of strength and fulfillment. His father was proud of him, not just for the career he was building, but for the way he had managed to find a balance between his responsibilities and his passions. As the young man settled into his new role, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had come so far from the person who had felt lost and overwhelmed. He had learned that life wasn't about choosing between dreams and responsibilities. It was about finding a way to honor both, to live with purpose and passion, and to be true to oneself. Looking ahead, the young man was filled with hope. He knew that life would continue to present challenges, but he was no longer afraid of them. He had learned to face adversity with grace, to take things one day at a time, and to never give up on the dreams that had once seemed out of reach. His journey was far from over, but he had discovered something invaluable along the way: the power of perseverance, the importance of balance, and the strength that comes from living with purpose. He wasn't just building a future for himself. He was creating a life that was full of meaning, love, and the joy of knowing that he had the power to shape his own destiny. The young man's life was far from predictable, but for the first time in a long time it felt balanced. The days of feeling overwhelmed by responsibilities had given way to a sense of clarity. He wasn't simply surviving anymore. He was living with purpose. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had shaped him into someone stronger and more self-aware. As time passed, the young man's career continued to grow. The opportunity he had taken in the previous part of the journey had turned out to be everything he had hoped for. It wasn't just the job he had always wanted. It was a way for him to reconnect with his own passions, to finally give himself the space to chase after the dreams he had set aside for so long. He worked tirelessly, pouring his heart and soul into his projects. The joy of doing what he loved, of contributing to something meaningful, made every late night and early morning worth it. His colleagues began to notice the change in him. He wasn't just the guy who worked hard anymore. He was the one who brought energy and excitement to every task, the one who inspired others to give their best. He was living proof that it was possible to build a career while still being true to what mattered most in life. But even with all the success, there was still a part of him that worried. It wasn't about his work or his dreams anymore. It was about his father. The young man had promised himself that he would always be there for his family, especially his father. But as his own career began to flourish, he wondered if he was spending enough time with the person who had sacrificed so much for him. His father's health had improved significantly, and while he no longer needed the same level of care, the young man still made sure to check in on him regularly. Their relationship had deepened over the past months. What had once been an obligation had turned into something more meaningful, an opportunity to bond, to learn from each other, and to share in the ups and downs of life. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, his father turned to him and smiled. There was a look of quiet pride in his eyes, one that spoke volumes without needing any words. "I see you, son," he said softly. "You've come a long way. I'm proud of who you've become. But I also want you to know that I'm okay now. I want you to live your life fully, not just for me." The young man's heart swelled with gratitude. His father had always been a rock for him, the one constant in a world that had often felt unpredictable. But now he realized his father was giving him something even more precious than support. He was giving him permission to live, to dream, to move forward without the guilt that had once held him back. For the first time, the young man allowed himself to fully embrace the idea that he could have it all. He didn't have to choose between caring for his father and pursuing his dreams. The two could coexist, and they had. In fact, it was his love and care for his father that had given him the strength and perspective to build the life he had always wanted. The following weeks were filled with new opportunities. The young man started to take on more ambitious projects at work, things that pushed him out of his comfort zone. He had always been hesitant to take risks, to put himself in situations where failure was possible. But now, with the support of his father and the confidence he had gained from his journey, he began to take those risks with courage. He also began to reconnect with the world outside of work. He spent more time with friends, going to events he had once thought he didn't have time for. He found joy in the simple things again. The laughter of friends, the quiet moments of solitude, and the sense of accomplishment that came from balancing the demands of life. He had once believed that success meant working endlessly, sacrificing his personal life for the sake of his career. But now he knew that true success was about balance, about nurturing the parts of his life that mattered most. One day, while taking a walk through the park, the young man found himself reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. He thought about the long hours, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt, and the people who had helped him along the way. He had come so far, and yet he felt like he was just getting started. In that moment, he realized that the journey was never really about the destination. It had always been about the process, about the growth that came from each experience, each challenge, and each success. He had learned to appreciate the small moments, the ones that had once seemed insignificant. The quiet mornings spent with his father, the moments of laughter with friends, the feeling of accomplishment that came with doing what he loved. It wasn't the fame, the money, or the recognition that mattered. It was the relationships, the personal growth, and the sense of fulfillment that came from living a life that was true to himself. The young man had learned that the real measure of success wasn't found in the accomplishments he had achieved, but in the person he had become. As the years went on, the young man continued to thrive. His career flourished, his relationship with his father deepened, and he built a life that he was proud of. He never lost sight of the lessons he had learned along the way, the importance of balance, of perseverance, and of living with purpose. He never forgot the sacrifices he had made, nor the people who had helped him along the way, and most of all, he never stopped dreaming. Because he had learned that no matter how far he had come, there was always more to explore, more to learn, and more to achieve. The journey was never over. It was a constant process of growth, of discovery, and of living a life that was meaningful every single day. As time continued to pass, the young man's life became a balance between his career, personal growth, and his commitment to his father. He had come so far, from the days of feeling overwhelmed and torn between responsibilities and dreams, to now feeling grounded and in control. But even as he looked back at the progress he had made, he understood that life was not static. Change was constant, and it wasn't always easy to embrace. The challenges never truly stopped. There were moments when work became more demanding, or when life threw unexpected obstacles his way. But he had learned how to handle those challenges. He had learned that the key wasn't to avoid difficulties, but to face them head-on, with patience and resilience. One day, while sitting at his desk, he received a call from his old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. The conversation was casual at first, catching up on old times, but soon the friend asked about his life, how things were going with his father and his career. The young man paused for a moment. It had been so long since he had truly reflected on how far he had come. "I'm doing well," he said, his voice filled with a sense of accomplishment. "It hasn't been easy, but I've learned a lot. I've learned how to balance everything, how to not lose myself in the process." His friend was quiet for a moment. "That's incredible," they said. "I remember back when you were struggling to figure everything out. It's amazing to hear how much you've grown." The conversation was a reminder of how much had changed. The young man realized that his journey wasn't just about him. It was about the people who had been there for him, supporting him even when he didn't realize it. His friends, his colleagues, and especially his father, they had all played a part in his transformation. The conversation sparked something in him. He began to reflect on the way he had approached life up until that point. He had always been focused on the destination, the end goal. But now he saw that the real growth had happened during the journey itself. It was the small moments, the quiet victories, the lessons learned from every setback that had shaped him into who he was today. It was then that he realized he had been holding on to an idea that no longer served him. He had been so focused on balancing everything perfectly, on being the perfect son, the perfect employee, the perfect person, that he had forgotten what it was like to truly enjoy the journey. He had spent so much time doing what he thought he had to do that he had lost sight of what he wanted to do. So he decided to make a change. He wouldn't abandon his responsibilities. His father still needed him, and his work was important to him, but he would start to focus more on the things that brought him joy. He would make time for the little things that had always mattered but had often been pushed aside. He would start to prioritize his own happiness again. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would still be times when he had to make sacrifices. But he was ready to take that step. The young man knew that he had already proven to himself that he could handle the challenges life threw his way. Now, he was ready to embrace the next chapter of his journey, one that was more about fulfillment and joy than about simply surviving or meeting expectations. One evening, as he sat down for dinner with his father, the conversation turned to the future. His father had been listening to the young man's plans for the next few months, and there was a proud look in his eyes. "I'm so glad to see you doing what makes you happy," his father said. "You've worked hard for so long, and now it's time for you to enjoy life. You've earned it." The young man smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He had spent so much time thinking about what was best for others, and now he was beginning to understand that it was equally important to consider his own well-being. His father's words gave him the permission he needed to pursue the things that would make him happy, without guilt, without hesitation. From that day forward, the young man approached life with a renewed sense of purpose. He still dedicated time to his father and his work, but he also started to explore new passions, hobbies, and experiences that had been waiting for him. He traveled, met new people, and tried new things. He allowed himself to dream again, to believe that there was more to life than just the daily grind. The changes weren't always instant, and there were moments of doubt. But over time, he began to see how much richer his life had become. He had rediscovered parts of himself that he had long forgotten. The man who had once been consumed by guilt and obligation had transformed into someone who was living with intention, embracing every part of his journey. As the years passed, he continued to balance his career, his family, and his dreams. He had learned to let go of perfectionism and to appreciate the messy, unpredictable nature of life. It wasn't always easy, but he had grown stronger with every challenge, more resilient with every setback. One day, as he sat with his father, in the same living room where they had shared so many quiet moments, he realized just how far they had both come. His father, once frail and dependent, was now healthier than ever, and he, once lost in the chaos of life, had found his way back to himself. They had both weathered storms, faced challenges, and emerged stronger on the other side. Looking back, the young man understood that his journey had been about more than just achieving his dreams. It had been about learning how to live fully, how to embrace the process, and how to find joy in the little moments. He had found peace with the choices he had made and the path he had walked, and in that moment he knew that life wasn't about having all the answers. It was about living with purpose, making the most of every opportunity, and being present in the journey, wherever it took him next.